Stanley's words were still ringing in my head the next morning as we rode across Pearl Harbor. I blinked, bleary-eyed, at the bright sun rising over the submarine base. I'd stayed up too late last night replaying yesterday's events like they were scenes from the movie. The sailors were watching on the fantail of the USS Arizona, just offshore. I hadn't been able to see the screen, but I could hear the soundtrack through my open window, see the flicker of blue-white light. If only I could rewrite yesterday's script, change the action and the dialogue, and recast myself as the hero. But it was too late. That was a wrap on me and Stanley. Stanley leaned back in the boat, closing his eyes and spreading his arms wide. "Another beautiful day in paradise," he said with a smile. "You got that right, kid," said the sailor at tiller. Stanley and I couldn't exactly take our little motorboat to the Utah and leave it tied to a battleship, so we were riding in one of the Navy motor launches that puttered around the harbor. I held fast to my side of the boat, trying to not look too uneasy as we bounced across the water. It was early and most of Pearl Harbor was still asleep as we came around the east side of Ford Island, past the hospital ship Solace. I glanced over at Stanley. After he'd dropped that bomb on me at dinner, I'd finished my hamburger as fast as I could and hurried home. I hadn't said a word to anybody or come out of my room again until this morning. To my surprise, Stanley had met me at the pier in his usual good spirits, talking about how excited he was for our battleship tour. The black eye he'd gotten yesterday was full on purple now and as big as a baseball. Otherwise, it was like nothing had happened, which I couldn't believe. Stanley was pretty easygoing, but was all really forgiven? His disappointment and anger had to still be there, lurking under the surface like a shark or a giant eel. I remembered Florida and how my friendships there had died slow and painful deaths. First, Stanley would be too busy to hang out one weekend. Then he would start taking the ferry home from baseball practice instead of us riding together in his boat. Then he would stop sharing his comics with me and tell me he'd already read the ones I'd offered to share with him. Then he would find somebody else to draw superheroes with. Stanley opened his good eye and looked at me. "You know the best part about going to the Utah," he said? "No Japanese school." While I got to sleep in and eat pancakes and read comic books on Sundays, Stanley's mom made him go into Honolulu after church for Japanese school. Stanley was always griping about how they made him learn Japanese and all these Japanese tradition things, like how to arrange flowers and pour tea. Japanese school was one of Stanley's favorite topics to complain about, even though his grandmother taught the classes. "That's good," I said cautiously, still waiting for Stanley to drop the act and tell me we were through as friends. Instead, he leaned forward. "Hey, I was thinking about the arsenal last night," Stanley said. "Maybe he's some kind of space ranger." I blinked. You want to talk about our comic book?" I asked, "but I thought you said—" I bit the rest of that sentence off. Yesterday, Stanley had questioned my worthiness to write superhero comics. But if he was over it today, maybe that meant our friendship hadn't imploded like Krypton. "Sure," I said cautiously. "Maybe the Arsenal is the guardian of his planet and defends it against alien invaders." "He should definitely protect his own planet," said Stanley. "But he should travel to other planets and fight for other people too. A real hero steps in when they see people getting hurt, no matter what." Ah, there it was. Stanley had only brought up the Arsenal to hammer home his point about me. He hadn't let it go after all. He'd just been waiting to drop a lightning bolt on me like Shock Gibson. I shrank against the side of the boat. We really were over, me and Stanley. I wished suddenly that I would fall overboard and that a giant eel would eat me and put an end to it. "That's what superheroes do," Stanley said, talking on like he hadn't just killed me. "That's what makes Superman so awesome." I stared at Stanley, trying to see the spite behind his eyes. That's what he was doing, wasn't it? Rubbing it in. I'd seen nastiness in the eyes of kids back in Florida when they'd made fun of me. Cruelty. But it was weird. There was none of that in Stanley, not that I could see at least. I thought you didn't like Superman, I said wearily. He has too many powers, Stanley said, but I do like that he uses his powers to help people who are in trouble for no other reason than it's the right thing to do. Okay, I thought, I get it. I looked away with a frown. Our boat rounded the north end of Ford and turned down Carrier Row, headed for the Utah. Carrier Row was where the Navy's aircraft carriers were usually parked. Today, the Utah and the light cruisers Raleigh and Detroit were docked there because the carriers were all at sea on patrol. A couple of civilian bum boats had pulled up alongside the Navy ship to sell newspapers and cigarettes and treats, and a launch with sailors dressed up for church gave friendly salutes to passing boat filled with groggy sailors coming back from a night out partying in Honolulu. Otherwise, most everybody else not on duty was sleeping in. I looked at Stanley again. I had to explain why I hadn't fought with him yesterday, so he'd understand. But before I could build up the courage to speak, the launch came alongside the Utah. Stanley and I climbed a ladder on the port side of the ship, and I tried to think of anything besides falling into the water and getting crushed between the hulls of the battleship and the launch. I reminded myself that port meant left on a ship when you were facing the front, and starboard meant right. Today, the Utah was parked so the port side faced the harbor, and Ford Island was to starboard. "There's my guys," Brooks Leonard said as we came aboard. "Right place, right time." He smiled and shook our hands like we were adults. Brooks had on his white baseball uniform with the word Utah written in cursive on his chest. Not many of the other Utahs were up and about. Amidships, a sailor in white shorts and a white t-shirt sat on air vent with his legs up on the rail, reading the Sunday comics. Farther aft, the Utah's band had assembled, ready to play the national anthem when the color guard raised the American flag. Despite the tension with Stanley, I felt an electric thrill standing on the deck of a real battleship. It was just so big and solid. Every inch of the Utah was wood and steel. It felt powerful, invincible, like the safest place in the world. I wanted to never leave. "Let me give you guys the grand tour," Brooks said, waving for us to follow him. "The Utah is a battleship, but an old one. She was decommissioned from fighting after the First World War. She weighs more than 30,000 tons, and from stem to stern, she's about 1.5 football fields long. Freshly scrubbed teak decks stretched out in every direction, and enormous wooden covers shrouded what must have been the Utah's guns. Round gray air vents sprouted from the deck like metal mushrooms, and ropes and chains were coiled everywhere I looked. Hatches and doorways led to stairs and ladders that disappeared into the decks below, and the outside edge of the deck was ringed with rope railings. Brooks explained that the Utah was only used for anti-aircraft gun training and target practice now. "We cover the decks with loose lumber and planes drop dummy bombs on us," he said, putting his hands on a big stack of timbers as thick as tree trunks. "These protect the real deck and show the pilots where they hit," he laughed. "Pretty funny, huh? I joined the Navy and the only people shooting at me are other Navy guys." Stanley was totally focused on what Brooks was saying, but I was still distracted. Stanley was the best friend I'd ever had, and I couldn't bear the thought of him thinking less of me. I had to make things right with him. It was time to tell him why I was the way I was. Brooks asked us to follow him to the rear of the ship, and I saw my chance. "Stanley, I'm sorry about yesterday," I said. Stanley stiffened. "It doesn't matter," he said. "It does to me," I said. "I didn't mean to. You see, a few years ago Dang it! I wasn't saying it the way I wanted to say it. See, back when I lived in Florida, there was this incident. I started, but I didn't get a chance to finish, because that was the moment the whole world turned upside down."